Greetings, beautiful people. Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Off the Record, but on my mind. I am your host, J Dominique, aka J Dot, and today I want to bring to you a topic of discussion that's near and dear to my heart. It's something that in my 15 years of public service as an educator has been a topic of concern and a topic of debate throughout my whole career. And it has only been amplified with the latest verdict in the Carmelo Anthony case. And the topic that I want to discuss today, very briefly, is defending yourself in school or on school property. So if you have a school-aged child, I think you should really tune in and kind of take stock in what I'm positing, what I'm going to bring to the discussion. Think about it, see how it makes sense or if it makes sense to you, and whether or not you are aware of these things. And especially if you are a person of color, your child is a person of color, there are certain subcultural norms that are different. Not to say that they're better or worse, but they tend to be different than major mainstream American perspectives as it relates to how children conduct themselves on school property or in school sponsored settings. And so I want to dive right in and I want to make this distinction. I have a couple of friends that are in law enforcement, and I have a wide variety of friends that are educators in various stages in public education and some in private, you know. And so at the secondary, which is a middle or the high school level, I want to focus on those spaces because that's when children are starting to really come of age. And that's around the time where they get out of the childlike behaviors and get more into the young adult trying to find or fit into a certain affinity group type of mentality. And here's where we see a lot of this concept of defending yourself either show itself in a way in which people learn lessons and they're better off for it, or in very injurious ways in which all parties involved walk away with a loss. And so I want to make a distinction first between what is self-defense and what is typically considered mutual combatancy. Um, I obviously come from a background of urban environment, and I can remember being told as a child by my mother and also by my grandmother and by my uncles in various stages of my upbringing that if someone hits you, you hit them back. If someone tries to bully you, you stand up for yourself. And I do recognize that there's a certain level and necessity in that. And so I want to be able to kind of pull um, things apart and make them very, very simple. I recognize that there's nuance in this discussion, but I do want to speak in more simple black and white terms just so that we don't get caught up in the semantics of a thing. Now, if you live in an environment where you feel your children have to learn how to protect themselves in that dwelling in that environment where you live at, then teaching them how to defend themselves and arming them with a way to be able to move around in those physical spaces and be able to prevent or reduce harm to themselves. Or if you have multiple children, then you also have that notion of raising the oldest to protect the youngest, et cetera, et cetera. Boy protect the little girl, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to move that to the side, and I want to talk specifically about in the school context because I feel like this is where households that are come from more of a, I don't want to say impoverished background, but if nothing else, an urban background in which you're not in a suburban setting, right? There are definitely things inside of these environments that will cause you to develop a certain mentality that otherwise probably wouldn't even enter into your mind or into your parenting if you were not in those particular circumstances. But let's just stay focused on how this notion of defending yourself can become injurious for children of color in particular, right? And I'll explain why I'm staying with that particular position as I break this thing down. So, my generation, you know, your parents or whoever it was that was tasked with raising you typically taught you that you can't be a punk, you can't be someone that gets bullied. You have to learn how to stand up for yourself. You have to learn how to defend yourself and in the defense of yourself or others. And so the common mantra was if somebody puts their hands on you, you put your hands back on them. And the kids, took that in a wide variety of ways, right? I'll share bits and pieces of my upbringing just to kind of personalize what it is I'm saying. I don't at all feel like the way that was raised was the only way that children of color were raised, but I do see through lines, I do see trends, and I definitely have seen how this psychology tends to get students of color into tough and sticky situations as it relates to what happens at the schoolhouse. Okay. And so when you tell a child or you teach a child to defend themselves and you arm them with this notion that if someone puts their hands on you, you have the right to put your hands back on them, and you marry that to this term, defend yourself, then in the child's mind, they feel all they have to do is make sure that they're not the aggressor. They have to make sure that, okay, if there's going to be a confrontation, there's going to be a fight. What you have to do is make sure you're not the person to take the first punch. And for those of you that are of my generation, you remember how we used to stand shoulder to shoulder and would be in that person's face and be like, hit me. No, you hit me. No, hit me first. Hit me first. And even take it as far as, maybe in the young fourth, fifth, sixth grade, put a ruler, a pencil, something on somebody's shoulder, and you say, I dare you to knock this off my shoulder. If you knock this off my shoulder, then I'm gonna fire on you. Or in today's um, terminology, we're gonna squabble, right? It's gonna be a fade. And so we understood then that we didn't want to negate what our parents or guardians or whoever it was that was instructing us. We didn't want to negate their instructions on how we could successfully do this thing called defending ourselves without actually having some sort of consequences at home. And so I remember when I got into, my many little squabbles and things between the grades of fourth grade and about seventh grade, I always made sure the first thing that my grandmother was made aware of is I didn't swing first. I didn't hit him first. They hit me. And the whole conversation would change. Yes. Did I get suspended? Absolutely. Was the principal trying to explain to my grandmother how my actions and my decision making contributed to why I'm being suspended? Absolutely. But the one thing I could rest easy knowing is that my grandmother wasn't going to punish me for the fight per se, for me getting suspended, as long as I could convince her that I was defending myself and that I didn't swing first. Now, there's been several times in my teaching career where I've spoken with parents that are people of color, and they lamented to me and they shared their frustration that they felt like their kids should not have been suspended because they were defending themselves. The other kid started it, the other kid was the aggressor. And so they feel like there's a hint of racism involved because their child got the short end of the stick. Or in instances where the child was presumed to have been defending themselves, they went above and beyond the fight and actually injured the would be aggressor to the point now where this child gets a harsher penalty, a harsher suspension, or the law might have been involved. And these parents are so frustrated because, as far as they're convinced, their child has the right to defend themselves, right? So mutual combatancy is typically what we are raising our children to consent to if we take that paradigm of thinking. If we say, hey, someone hits you, you hit them back, you start fighting, and whatever is going to happen after that, you know what, we can stand on the fact that this person did something to my child reacted, they have a right to defend themselves, and if that other child gets hurt, regardless to whatever level they've been injured, they deserved it because they're the ones that started it. That doesn't at all um, go over well in a school context, right? There is something called ed code that typically governs how suspensions and expulsions and things of that nature have to be carried out. There's certain criteria. There's these matrix that say, with these circumstances, this and this have to happen. But here's the simple, regular schmegular point that I want to make about that. Self-defense in a school context is totally different than mutual combatancy. Self-defense actually mimics what most state laws say, which is there's certain thresholds, certain criteria that has to be met in order for it to be determined as self-defense. And another key part of self-defense is that level of self-defense, the action has to be equal to whatever the offense is. It can't be excessive. It can't be, okay, this kid threw a pencil and hit me in the head. So I grabbed a chair and smacked him over the head with the chair. That's not self-defense. But in the eyes of many parents that grow up in urban environments where unfortunately, you have to be able to harden your child and prepare your child to be able to defend themselves in any kind of circumstances. And out in the streets, it's less controlled and there's so much more danger involved with street fighting, right? But most parents don't take the time to kind of think about or talk to their kids about those differences and what degrees the application, right? You're in your mind, I just want to make sure that my child is safe. I want to make sure they can defend themselves. I don't trust the school system. I don't trust the administration, the teachers, because it seems like whenever we talk about someone doing X, Y, Z to my child, they always have an excuse, or I don't feel like my child has been adequately protected. So I'm teaching them, I'm arming them with being able to protect themselves. That's the psychology of certain parents, right? And so mutual competency is when you agree to actually fight with someone else. If you're having a discussion and someone says, I'm going to do A to you, and you say, well, if you do A to me, I'm going to do B to you, or I dare you to do B or C to me, and I bet you that this is going to happen, that's not going down the road of self-defense, right? Yes, you do have a right to defend yourself with words. You do have a right to tell someone that if you don't do this, then this may be the recourse. But self-defense typically looks like something that in most inner city communities in particular, and with people of color, most of the times would consider to be a cowardly act, right? If someone is threatening you and you don't stand up to them, if you're not ready to meet their aggression with you with violence, then somehow you are being punked, right? You're being belittled, your ego is being bruised, you're being humiliated, and so that can't take place, or else in many people in these conditions in their mind, they think that's going to beget more and more people trying to do harm to you because they see that you didn't stand up with yourself with this person. So that puts you in a position where you may have to deal with more people trying to victimize you. Not saying that that's not the case, not saying that that's not a valid argument. But what I am saying is this: in a schoolhouse, it's simple. If someone decides that they want to threaten you verbally or that they do put their hands on you, you are supposed to get adult involved. You're supposed to go to the security guard. You're supposed to go to the teacher. You're supposed to go to the counselor, to the administrator, and tell them this is what happened to me. Student said X, Y, Z to me. I feel threatened. I really, really feel like there is a great chance that they're going to try and do bodily harm to me. They told me they're going to meet me in the bathroom, or they're going to meet me out in the place where the cameras aren't at, or they're going to meet me off campus, and I'm fearful for that. Or they hit me. I have every opportunity to haul off and hit them back, but I exercise restraint, and I'm coming to you because you're supposed to be the ones that are supposed to be protecting me. I'm coming to the campus supervisor, I'm coming to the teacher, I'm coming to the counselor, I'm coming to the administrator, so that you can intervene in a way in which the school policies say I'm supposed to do. And most people that teach their children to defend themselves, that's not what they advocate for their child to do, right? There's these subcultural thought processes that you're a weakling, you're a sap, you're a punk, all these labels, right? And so there's this pressure to have to perform. If a person hits you in a classroom or on a school site or in the school sponsored event, and you go tell, there's supposed to be a mechanism in place that takes place immediately after that, that's supposed to respond to that, and you're supposed to be clear and free. But that doesn't remove how you feel about yourself, doesn't remove the court of public opinion, and people might poke fun at the child or call them a snitch, et cetera, et cetera. But it doesn't put them in line for a suspension or worse, an expulsion, right? Most people would say a person has the right to defend themselves with violence if someone begets violence on them, but that's not the appropriate or the lawful way to go about it. on a school campus. And that's where people get their children in trouble. That's where this culture of no snitching and you got to be tough and you got to be able to do X, Y, Z. That's where it gets these young people, and in particular, young people of color, and more specifically, young boys of color in trouble because um, we know that growing up, if you get into an altercation with a white person, there is a likelihood, probably a good likelihood, that they're going to tell someone that you did XYZ to them, or they're going to call the cops on you if you did XYZ to them, or they're going to call the cops or get someone involved if they actually feel threatened from you based on what you said to them. We know that to be true in our communities, even if we want to pretend as if that's not the case, or if we have white friends that aren't aware of that. We know and we're conditioned to feel like you got to be very, very particular about how you aggress a white person because they may call the cops on you. And we accept that. I've seen hardened criminals. I've seen young guys that thought they was the toughest of the toughest actually show restraint when it comes to doing some sort of bodily harm to a white kid because they're like, no, they'll get their parents involved, or no, they're just gonna snitch, they're just gonna call the cops, or they're gonna tell the principal, right? We don't think highly of them. We still feel that they are weak and wimpy and all these things that any child that chooses to go that route is called or thought of as. But the difference is that there's less of an an attempt to do bodily harm to them, especially in a public place, because we know that's on the table with them. Unfortunately, that's taken off the table in inner city communities with black and brown children. That's taken off of the table, right? Parents don't want their kids to be labeled as snitches. They don't want to have to deal with the potential ramifications if their kid does decide to go and talk and cooperate in a school setting or out in a public setting with the law. But that's what's required in a school setting, right? The way that self-defense actually comes into play is mostly, and I tell students, I told my son this, I raised my son and daughter to understand this. If someone has cornered you, if they placed you in a position where you feel like you have to respond in violence, meet their level of violence in order to figure out how to escape, right? If you and somebody get into a skirmish and they throw a punch and you throw a punch and you back up and you can get away to where now you're not in a position to where you may be put in bodily harm, now you're supposed to step away from that. Sure, kids are going to call you whatever they're going to call you. Sure, the person is going to be like, oh, you're scared, you don't want none. But the difference is you actually exercise one of the main thresholds for self-defense. You are only meeting their force with force in an opportunity to be able to escape any potential next bodily steps of bodily harm. But that's not typically how people raise their children in inner city communities. And it shows up in the schoolhouse when someone has to leave work, someone has to come in and they sit down with the administrators and they hear both sides of the conversation and they say that little such and such actually hit your child. And then as a result, your child did this and they started fighting. And so what we're going to do is we're going to suspend them both. Even if they say they're going to suspend the aggressor for more days, then, the child that the parents are now questioning why they have to miss school when all they did was defend themselves. I wish my people and people of colors would just understand that's how laws are created. That's the cultural norm in America. That's not to say that white children and white adults do not break those particular tenets and they're not as aggressive. But if you've lived on planet Earth as long as I have, you've been able to see how, yes, our belief that all we have to do is be provoked into engaging in some sort of fight gives us justification for that fight. That is the key error that can cause something like what happened with Carmelo Anthony to happen. If a person is on school property and they are being bullied, there are these factors that have to take place. Now, make no mistake about it. As an educator of more than 15 years, we do not want to see anyone bullied, right? It breaks our hearts to see that someone is being victimized, especially when What can happen is one person stepping forward on that person's behalf and just sharing what happened, taking it to the administrators, being able to take it to the peace officer on campus or to the campus supervisors, and just being willing to share and explain what happened, right? But that goes against these tenets of no snitching, right? So what happens in the school context is kids get bullied all day long in every single way possible, as long as they're being pushed into silence, as long as the culture of the place is you don't say anything. You can take a look at it, but don't say anything. We have another layer to this that's even more crazy. Anytime there is an issue where a fight breaks out, most of the kids will pull out their phones and they'll record what's going on, right? Because they want to have it for their own personal viewing pleasure. But when it's time to step up and when an administrator or a security guard or a peace officer comes up and they're like, hey, we need someone to be able to show us what happened. If you're on the site where there aren't adequate cameras to capture it, we're looking for one person, just one person to be able to show what happens. Seldom does that happen, right? What happens is that one of these kids posted on social media somewhere, and if it's a big enough, type of event, then I guess it reaches the cops' radar, and then they'll be able to come back to the school and they'll be able to use that, as evidence for what happened. But what happens in the schoolhouse based on a day-to-day understanding is that people of color kind of set their children up for failure in that context if they don't recognize that there's certain protocols that you have to do in order to be protected by ed code, in order to be protected by the rules of the school district, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where I feel the disconnect is, right? Yes, if we take the time, and information is everywhere, right? We live in a day and age where we can get information about anything, right? I remember going online and looking at what the self-defense statutes and laws were for the city and the state in which I live in, and reading them. Yeah, they're dry, but they're clear cut. It's a clear cut understanding. I recall going back to my son, who's the eldest of my son and my daughters, and having to tweak what I initially taught him, because at first, before I became an educator, I taught him that he needs to be able to defend himself. And I even had a feeling that if he defended himself and he got suspended for it, I was fine with that as long as the school gave him his schoolwork. Because at the end of the day, I just want to make sure that he has the confidence and that there's no one that's going to try to pick on him, right? That was my former psychology as it relates to self-defense at school. But once I started realizing that you can't claim self-defense if you're unaware of what self-defense is, and you can't get frustrated and pissed off with the school that your child attends or the school district in which your school is a part of if they have clear-cut rules about fighting and about violent interactions with students. And lastly, I'll throw in there the thing about weapons, right? Thinking about what happened in this case, and the question is, why would this young man have a knife at a school event, right? That's a whole nother thing to unpack. But the reality is that if we, members of the school community, are to be able to protect the children, the students that are under our charge, as long as they're on the facility, at the facilities, or they're on the school campus, it's important that no weapons are ever brought on campus. Now, there's really only two ways in which we can figure out whether or not students have weapons. One is if you have metal detectors at every entry and exit point to be able to determine that, or have peace officers or your campus supervisors there doing random checks of everyone on the way in. But that also heightens the sense of scaredness and not being protected if you send your child to a school that has metal detectors XYZ, right? That would be the surefire way to try to limit the vast majority of weapons. The only other way that we can figure out whether a child has a weapon is if someone else comes forward and they either anonymously or in good faith going to a counselor, teacher, et cetera, says, hey, student A has this weapon on them. And then the school does a good job of setting it up so that they do random searches and they pull that person in immediately. And if you get caught with the weapon, then you go to everything the ed code says. It's out of the teacher's hand. The students are better protected because that mechanism is in place. But that's the only two ways in which a school can safeguard students from students bringing weapons, right? So it's unfortunate that this young man put himself in a position to where he has a deadly weapon and he feels like he has to use it, right? That is what prompted me to really, really decide I just wanted to sit and have a conversation with you all very briefly about it, because that's where the origin story is. The origin is the level of comfortability of bringing weapons or fighting at a school setting or at a school sponsored event. So the best thing that you can do as parents is to prepare your children with how to follow the law first. That way, it just covers everything. And if the school district has more stringent rules than what the state law is, then it's your job to be able to go and advocate for your child and defend your child by either going in and talking to administration or taking it to a school board meeting and sharing, your concerns about safety. There's an incident or there's a set of circumstances in the city that I currently am in which there are citizens that have brought suit to the local school board because they feel as if their children are being targeted for racially motivated bullying. And I hate to hear or see any kind of bullying of any sort, especially with young people, right? But it did make me feel good to hear that these parents have decided to become advocates of their children and to say, you know what, we are entrusting you as a school and as a school board with our children. Every time they walk onto your campus, you have a fiduciary duty to protect them, to make sure that the environment is such to where they can learn free and clear of a fear of harm being done to them, right? That's not just an obligation, that's the law, right? So as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking these instances are coming up, and I wonder if parents' ears are perking up. I wonder if parents are actually thinking, you know what? I may need to educate myself so that I can educate and arm my children for success. Uh, the argument is that bullying has been going on since the beginning of time. There's no space on planet Earth that is devoid of bullying. You can send some kids to church, and somewhere in Sunday school there might be some bullying. You send them to Boy Scouts, there might be some bullying. You send them to participate in various youth sports, there's bullying, right? You send them to school, there's bullying. But there's a way to be able to mitigate the reality that there is a bully culture almost everywhere, so that a student, someone that hasn't even really, really reached the threshold of adulthood to be able to make good, sound decisions, doesn't feel compelled or justified to make a horrible decision that can change their life and maybe someone else's life in a way that cannot be reversed. So, if you've been rocking with me for this long, thank you for listening. Hopefully, I said some things that kind of sparks your interest, something that can get you thinking. We have all this technology. If you're a parent, sit down, go through, take the time that you could be doing something else that's leisurely, and educate yourself on what goes on in your city and state level as it relates to self-defense. Look at what the school district has on their school district websites, the policies, just so that you're clear, so that if you have to come up to the school and advocate for your child or gain a better understanding, you don't get turned away with that frustration and feeling like you're not heard, or that the way you raise your child is not compatible or congruent with what the school culture is. And now you feel like your child is being punished for something that they should reasonably be able to do. The reality is that the way you parent doesn't necessarily have to align with what the public says. But in public spaces where laws and statutes and ed code is the way in which um, your innocence or guilt is determined, you owe it to your child to make sure you understand those things and you make sure you arm them with the knowledge of those things. So since the beginning of the time, there's been bullying. There's no way to prevent it 100% from happening, but there definitely is ways for you to raise your child to be able to navigate through that space and become really courageous. one of the most courageous things you can do is not necessarily ball up your fist and throw blows, is to be able to advocate for yourself in a way in which you can create and maybe spark change around you as a result of your action. And I promise you, if students go to a school where the school culture is that people speak up and speak out about bullying, bullying is dramatically and drastically limited and minimized. In places where there's no snitching culture, is the law of the land. In places where administrators are not willing to be proactive in creating good, positive school cultures, in places where there aren't cameras and other things put in place to be able to catch these things and capture them and to prosecute. I hate to say it, but young people to the largest extent of the law, sometimes that's necessary in order to be able to minimize bullying. But simply thinking that the way to minimize bullying is to teach your child to be tougher than the other child and prepare your child to be able to fight and ball their fists up and do bodily harm to anyone that threatens them verbally, let alone physically, you may find yourself in the situation that Carmelo Anthony's parents found themselves in. So, just a little food for thought. To the next episode. Peace.